Domo arigato, geek to me radio, da 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 da. Domo arigato, geek to me radio, da 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 da.
Welcome, geeks and nerds, girls and boys, to a brand new edition of Geek to Me Radio. Tonight, we've got writer Bev Vincent talking about his brand new Stephen King book that's out September 13th. We'll talk about how you can get it. We'll talk about what's in it. And then later on, if you're enjoying the Sandman series on Netflix, we'll have my interview with composer David Buckley talking all about creating the sounds for Sandman. All that and more. Stand by.
We're talking TV, comics and movies, and video games. And if you don't know Star Trek from Star Wars, we'll try to explain. There are 12 doctors for Hogwarts houses, one ring rules them all. To be the greatest Pokemon master, you must catch them all. You must catch them all. Try to catch them all. Gotta catch them all. Gotta catch them all.
And if you're driving around the greater St. Louis, hearing us on the Big 550 KTRS, hello to all of you, and thank you for listening. If you're streaming us out there in the world via the KTRS app or online, hello to you as well. And of course, if you're watching us on YouTube and Facebook tonight, hello to you, and thank you very much for watching. If you're hearing us after the fact in the podcast form, definitely a big shout out and thanks to you. Hopefully you are hitting the subscribe button, whatever platform you're hearing us on. Hit the subscribe button. If you haven't already, leave us a nice 5-star review. That makes Joey V smile every time we get a 5-star review on Facebook. It helps us out in the search engine optimization as well. We do greatly appreciate that, as we do with just all of you listening tonight. We appreciate that as well. My guests certainly appreciate your listening as well, of course. Writer Bev Vincent, Stephen King and him, best of friends, and he's got a brand new book out talking all about Stephen King. It's called Stephen King, A Complete Exploration of His Work, Life, and Influences, and it's due out September 13th, just the week before Stephen King's birthday. Bev Vincent, thank you for your time tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on.
Of course. So you've worked with Stephen King on a lot of other projects. Now you've got this book out. How did you first meet Stephen King?
Well, the very first time I met him, he was in Houston, Texas for a book signing in 1987. So I, like everybody else who was a fan, I just went down to the River Oaks bookstore and lined up and had him sign a book. Ultimately, it was online connections. Once the internet started kicking off, things started happening. I started writing a column for Cemetery Dance magazine, which he reads regularly. He's contributed to. He had a short story in it early on in their career, and we just started communicating over the years, mostly about things in common that we like to read or watch on television or movies or things like that.
So when you're starting out, you're doing these columns and everything like that. Let's go back a few years before this. What got you into wanting to be a writer? Period. Be it for a column, be it for books and everything like that. When did you know you wanted to be a writer?
Well, it's a long tale with some gaps in it. I wrote some short stories when I was in grade school. We had an option one time, rather than take an exam or do an essay, we could write something creative fiction. So I wrote an Agatha Christie influenced story in eighth grade, which went over very well. When I went to university, and we're talking late 70s, early 80s, that's when I discovered Stephen King. I picked up a copy of Salem's Lot, and then I backtracked to read his other stuff, and I was really taken by the stories in Night Shift. And I started writing a lot of short stories in my undergraduate years that were heavily influenced by the stories in Night Shift. But I didn't write again for a long time after that because I got tied up in graduate school and jobs and things like that. So about 1999 or 2000, I decided I want to write again. And that's when Richard Chismar coincidentally contacted me and asked if I'd write this column for every issue of Cemetery Dance magazine, which was King news and reviews and commentary. And so that's been something I've been carrying on for over 20 years.
Wow.
But at the same time, I also dug into fiction, and I've been writing a lot of short stories and things since then.
So I take it you probably obviously read every single Stephen King story and novel out there and everything like that. What if you had to pick your top 5 favorites of Stephen King's entire work? What would they be?
Okay, so that's easier. People often ask me for my favorite, and that one really paralyzes me. But Salem's Lot, excellent novel, but also because it was my introduction.
Sure.
The Shining and The Stand, Bag of Bones, and Lisey's Story.
With The Shining, I got to ask, because they had the movie that came out, obviously Jack Nicholson, very famous film. They did the remake with Steven Weber, and from what I've heard, and again, it's it's on the internet, so it must be true, Stephen King preferred the Steven Weber version. Did you guys have that conversation and talk about which one he actually liked better?
Well, there's no doubt he would prefer the Steven Weber one more because he produced and wrote that version. So, I mean, he was heavily involved. They actually filmed it at the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, where he was inspired to write the novel in the first place. I think he can probably appreciate Kubrick's version as a piece of art, but not as an adaptation of his novel. And I understand where he's coming, that sort of dichotomy. There's a lot of things that Kubrick did that are at odds with how he felt about the novel, but nobody's ever going to deny it's a great piece of art and, and a good movie in its own right, just not such a great adaptation, perhaps.
And I've got to say, in the past 5 years, we've seen a slew of sequels come out that have been 20, 30 years after the fact. Between you've got Top Gun Maverick, you've got obviously the Blade Runner sequel, but then there's Dr. Sleep, which I adored that movie. And I've seen interviews. Stephen King was pretty happy with the outcome as well.
That was a difficult tightrope for Flanagan to walk, because a lot of people know The Shining from Kubrick, and a lot of people know The Shining from King. And so he had to come up with something that sort of wove between the two. I mean, at the end of King's novel, The Shining, the Overlook Hotel is gone, whereas at the end of Kubrick, it's not. So how do you deal with that sort of duality? And I think he did a really good job. Plus, I mean, he did such an excellent job with casting that. And I mean, I'm a big fan of what Flanagan has been doing right from his very early days. Things like Oculus, and he really knows how to point the camera in a way that takes the audience along with them, and you know what you need to be seeing because of the way he directs things.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the it's a weird way to describe a horror movie, but it was a beautiful horror movie, if that makes sense. But and you've got the book out now, so we just talked about it. It's out on September the 13th. And this is all about his work, his life, his influences. Was this a book that you sat down and said, hey, I want to write this, kind of talk to him about it? How did the germ of this idea start?
Well, I started, I told you about writing for Cemetery Dance, and people kept asking me, when are you going to write a book about King's work? And to me, that at that time, it seemed like a daunting task. I mean, even in the early 2000s, he had such a vast library of books that, to tackle it seems to me just beyond scope. So I wrote a book called The Road to the Dark Tower in the early 2000s, which took, at that time, a 7-book series, which has connections to a lot of his other books. And I said, well, this is a way that I can address King's creative output in a more manageable way. And on the strength of that, in 2008, 2009, I was contacted by a publishing company that was hired by Barnes & Noble to write a reader's companion to Stephen King. And so the earlier version of that is a book called the Stephen King Illustrated Companion. And for that one, I was really limited in word count. So I could really only select a handful of his books to dive into. But I picked ones that had a lot of autobiographical component to the development of the book, or there was something going on in his life that was really important that boiled over into what he was working on. And that book was really interesting because we got to delve into King's archives and reproduce some never before seen letters and short stories, fragments and things like that. And they're included in the book as little documents that you can take out and look at. And so that book was really popular, but it was limited in its scope because it was only in Barnes & Noble stores, so it was only in America. It went out of print several times because it just kept getting bought out. And sometime last year, I went back to the publisher of that book, which had then been consumed by the Quarto group. They were Becker and Meyer, and they got bought out into
Okay,
Quarto.
yeah.
And I said, what do you think about doing an update to talk about some of his more recent stuff? And they said, well, how about a much more expanded book? And so that's what I did. I went back and I decided I was going to cover everything that he'd written book-wise. Not all at great depth, some of them only sort of in a superficial mention, but there were a lot of books that I didn't even get to mention in the previous book. Things that I really regretted not being able to talk about, things like his early 90s books, like Rose Madder and Gerald's Game and Dolores Claiborne. And so I was given a lot more room to explore all of that. Plus, I also, he's got two famous fictional creations, Castle Rock and Derry, two towns that appear in a lot of his books.
Right.
And so I thought, wouldn't it be cool to find everything he's ever written about those towns and sort of do an oral history of Castle Rock? And my first thought was that I'd create a map of it. But there are so many contradictions through the years that it just doesn't all hold together. My friend and artist Glenn Chadbourne had done a really nice illustration, artist's concept of what Castle Rock might look like. And so we reproduced that in the book. But, a street map just wasn't in the cards.
Right.
And then I did something similar for Derry. And Derry is easier because Derry you can almost superimpose over Bangor, Maine, because that was his inspiration for it. So there are interludes within the book that talk about things like those cities, or lots of sidebars of little interesting things like his work with the band and his Richard Bachman years and things like that. So it pretty much covers the whole scope of everything up to and including Fairy Tale, which comes out on September 6th.
And when you're doing a book like this, obviously you've got a relationship with him. Was this, I don't want to say collaborative because it's your book, but did you like, hey, I want to include this, but I'm not sure how to, like, how much did he have an impact on what you put in the book?
None whatsoever, really.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So for The Road to the Dark Tower, I did ask him a few questions while I was researching that book, because it was written mostly before the last three books in the Dark Tower series were published. He gave me the manuscripts of those three books so I could complete this book, and it came out just after the seventh Dark Tower book. And so I had a few questions of things that came up, and he very graciously answered them. For the Dark Tower Companion, which came later in about 2012 or 2013, I did an interview with him for that book. But he is aware of the fact that if he had too much involvement in one of these projects, that there might be a perception that he had veto power. And he understood that enough to say, you probably don't want that. This is your project, so go ahead and do what you wish. I'm hands off. He gave me some blurbs for the earlier books, but the one thing he did for these books was he gave us access to the archives so that we could pull out some really cool things that people have never seen before. Like we've got a copy of the wire that he got, the telegram, when Carrie was sold, because he didn't have a phone at the time, so the only way they could get in touch with him was to send him a telegram.
Wow.
So we got a copy of that in the book, and all sorts of really cool memorabilia, lots of photographs. It's heavily illustrated. And
so this is going to be the perfect thing if someone's not familiar with Stephen King and they want to learn more. But I think from what you're saying, even diehard fans, there's going to be something new for them as well. So this is like the perfect book to please whatever level they're at in their fandom. This is going to have something for everybody.
That's my hope. And the previous book was really popular among the fans, and this one it's twice as long. We've got some more cool things in it. It covers all sorts of things that didn't get handled before. So I think there's something in it for everybody, whether they're a longtime fan, a casual reader. In the first review I saw so far, somebody who got an early copy, they said, I'm not really the target audience for this book, but, and then they went on to talk about all of the interesting things that they found in it.
I mean, he's such a fascinating guy. Because I was talking, the last show host, Outdoors Dan, was asking me who I had on the show, and I told him who I had, and they were talking about Stephen King. When you think of horror writers, I don't think there's anyone bigger.
No, definitely not. No,
certainly not.
But he's also really generous. He's got a big platform. He's really active on Twitter, for example, and he uses that to elevate things that he likes. I mean, even things like there's some European shows that he mentions, and all of a sudden, they get a new season, they get renewed, or the actors are just blown over. That a little mention by him on Twitter just raises awareness of them, and he's been very generous to me over the years too, just in being a friend and collaborating. And I did get one just sort of pinch me opportunity, and that was to co-edit an anthology with him. A few years ago, we did a book called Flight or Fright, and that came out of his well-known fear of flying. And that was just a wonderful experience. We picked stories and he introduced them, and that was just it was a great experience and a great project.
Yeah, you mentioned his work on Twitter and how he can boost something like that. He's like the Mark Hamill of writers, because Mark Hamill's the same way. Mark Hamill will say, I really like Brooklyn Nine-Nine. All of a sudden, Brooklyn Nine-Nine's got renewed for another season. But yeah, I've seen that same level of influence that Stephen King has as well. It's luckily he uses his power wisely from what I've seen.
Yes, so. Absolutely. I mean, there was one writer named Meg Gardner who was really popular in the UK in the early parts of her career. And he wrote about her. He used to do a column for Entertainment Weekly. Every week he had a little page at the back. And occasionally he wrote about books he'd been reading. And he devoted most of a whole article to her work. And all of a sudden she got an American contract to publish her books over here. And just recently she's got a #1 bestseller because she co-wrote the Heat 2 with Michael Mann. So the sequel to Heat. So, yeah.
Very cool. It's good to hear, because it's always you always kind of wonder about people privately if they're these larger than life figures. So it's nice to hear from you and a couple other people I've talked to that he's actually a pretty good guy.
Oh yeah, he's great.
That's good to hear.
Great. And a lot of people think that maybe he's creepy or something like that. They have this perception because he did some things early in his career where he really sort of lampooned himself with the scary stuff. He did a credit card commercial where he came on, in a smoking jacket with a bird on his shoulder, and
I think I remember that.
Do you know me? People know me because of Kerry, but I always carry. And then he went on to the credit card thing. So he's been more visible, I think, than a lot of authors are. I mean, he's recognizable, whereas there's a lot of authors you wouldn't know what they look like if you passed them on the street.
Exactly, very much so. And again, if you're just now tuning in, we are talking with Bev Vincent about his book, Stephen King, a complete exploration of his life, his work, his life, and influences. You're okay to stick with us for a commercial break?
Absolutely.
Perfect. If you're listening, stick around. We're going to take a quick commercial break. We're going to come right back talking more Stephen King with writer Bev Vincent. You're listening to Geek to Me Radio right here on the Big 550 KTRS. Please stand by.
I love nuzzling up to you, Wind Whistler. You're so soft.
So soft, my little pony. My little pony is so soft to touch.
I love the way you feel my so soft pony. Paradise.
So soft,
Shady.
my little pony.
Wind
So
whistler.
soft, you're gonna love
Ribbon.
it so much. So nuzzly
Lofty.
soft, you're gonna love her
Each sold separately. They're so soft, My Little Pony. Shady and other so soft ponies sold separately from Hasbro.
Supernatural! Now you can join the battle between brave Lionheart and evil Skull and their eerie ghostlings.
Lion, you're dying. Now, Master.
They change to fight with ghostly might. Turn them into the light and they change into even more powerful creatures.
Now, the lion in me is free. Take this.
Supernaturals. Lionheart, Skull, and Ghostling sold separately. New from Tonka.
Why, hello, this is Scott Innes, better known as the voice of Scooby-Dooby-Doo, like in Shaggy Doo, in Scrappy-Doo, in like you're listening to Geek to Me Radio. Right, Uncle Scoob? Right, Rappy? Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
And we're back. Geek to Me Radio, heard every Sunday night here on the Big 550. I'm your host, James Enstall. Want to make sure we tell you about our premier sponsor, the people without whom we would not be on the air for these 6 years. 6 years now August has been our 6-year anniversary. Obviously, the City of St. Charles, the Greater St. Charles Convention and Visitors Bureau. If you want to get out and enjoy some of these last days of summer, I know it seems weird that we're already at the end of August and that fall's right around the corner, but here we are. And if you want to enjoy some warm weather out in the open, City of St. Charles has a lot of places where you can go and check out some fun. If you want to take the dog for a walk, if you want to bike ride the Katy Trail, maybe you want to go out and just have some fun walking around Main Street and getting some ice cream from Riverside Sweets. All that can be had right there in St. Charles, a picturesque cobblestone community made up of small businesses. You just go out there with the family, no matter what kind of fun you're looking to have. If you want to go, they've got obviously the casino out there if you're looking for something like that. A lot of great restaurants if you just want to go out and have some good food. If you want to do some shopping, maybe you've got some friends coming in, want to try out some unique shopping places. City of St. Charles has all of that right there. If you're from the greater St. Louis, St. Charles area, maybe you haven't been there for a while, go check out some of the new places that have popped up in the last couple of months. Maybe you're like Bev and you're from out of town. Come visit St. Charles. Start your trip, no matter where you're coming from, at the website, discoverstcharles.com. That's discoverstcharles.com. And get out there, support these small businesses. In this economy, that's always an important thing to do. Maybe you want to pick up a copy of Bev's book. It'll probably have it at Main Street Books right there in St. Charles, along historic Main Street. Lots of places to go have some fun and get out with the family. And like I said, enjoy these last days of summer. Make some memories with the family and friends. Start the trip at the website. Once again, discoverstcharles.com for an historically good time. We have Bev Vincent on talking about his book, Stephen King, a complete exploration of his life. I keep getting that backwards. His work, his life, and his influences. Talk a little bit about your fiction. You talked about the work you've done and everything like that too. What kind of fiction do you like inspires you?
Well, I started off because I was so heavily influenced by King in my early days. A lot of the stuff that I wrote was in the horror genre. And I dabbled in other things, but over the years, I've found that I'm more inspired by crime fiction. And a lot of what I've been writing these days has been in that genre. So I've published books, stories in things like Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine and Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. And even when I decide I'm going to write something that's science fiction or horror these days, there is a crime aspect to it. I published one recently in an anthology that was edited by Peter David.
Oh, wow.
The comic book artist.
Yeah.
And it's basically the Maltese Falcon set on a space station. So I've done a lot of that. But one thing that I did recently, which was really fun, so there's a horror writer named Brian Keene. And he and I have known each other forever, and we're always talking about the music that we listen to while we're writing. And we have very similar music tastes to a certain extent, but then there's places where we diverge. And we decided that we would write each other a playlist, a CD's list worth of songs of our own choosing for the other person to listen to while we each wrote a novella. And so we published that a couple of years ago in a book called Dissonant Harmonies. And so I listened to Brian's music only exclusively while I wrote, and he listened to my playlist. And not necessarily for literal interpretation for inspiration, but just for something that's in the background that's always there while we're writing. And so I wrote a novella called The Dead of Winter, which is set in the middle of a blizzard when really weird stuff starts happening.
Did you, and again, I'm not sure if this was your intention when you made the playlist, but did you craft the playlist with the purpose of giving the other a sense of the setting, the weather, and did you kind of craft it with that in mind, or is it just these are songs I like that inspire me, and kind of see where it went with the other person?
I think Brian was more intentional about the way he created his playlist. He definitely had a mood that he wanted to sort of convey. With me, it was more an idea of finding music that I thought Brian might not have heard before, that I thought would appeal to him or maybe sort of expand his horizons a little bit. I was fully aware of a lot of the musicians he liked, but I found some rare things by them that I thought he hadn't heard before. Plus, I went into some of the things I like, electronica, trance sort of music. And so I hit him with things like the Crystal Method and Schwangel and things like that, just to blow his mind a little bit. We're in the middle of doing the same thing again, and we've created our playlists for each other. He sent me one that's completely instrumental music. And I sent one that I think is a little bit more intentional this time to sort of guide him into a certain zone.
You mentioned one of your very early works that you did was based on Agatha Christie. So it sounds like there's been that constant kind of fascination with crime as a thread throughout your entire career then.
Definitely. And this novella I'm talking about, The Dead of Winter, is a little bit of a throwback to the Hardy Boys.
Oh.
The characters are just sort of loosely inspired by them. They're Frank and Joey. But I also thought, Hunter S. Thompson, because I knew Brian liked Hunter S. Thompson. So I thought, well, let's start the book with somebody who's high on drugs. And so Joey is going to pick Frank up at the airport, and he's just stoned out of his mind. And that sort of sets the tone for it. But it's a little bit of a biblical influence too. The story about the son who goes away and then comes back home again, where I switched it around this time. It's the good son that goes away. Frank goes off and has this career as a police officer, whereas the son who stayed back home really hasn't done much with his life. But now the two of them are brought back together again to try to solve this horrific mystery that's going on in their hometown.
And you said that you're doing it again. You're sending each other playlists. Will these be recurring characters, like a sequel to the last novel, or completely different everything?
Brian's would probably be different because his story was pretty much the end of the world kind of a story. Mine, if things go according to the way I'm thinking now, this will be a sequel.
Okay.
The original was called The Dead of Winter, and I'm thinking the next one will be called The Dead of Night.
So then if I want to make sure too, before, because I want to be cognizant of your time, website, if people want to go and explore more of your stuff, and I assume they can buy them directly from your website, it's probably the best way for people to get their hands on your books and everything like that.
So yeah, my website's bevvincent.com, BEV Vincent.com. I do have links to places where they can buy them. I don't sell books typically directly myself.
Okay.
For the new book, it will be available everywhere. Some booksellers like Cemetery Dance and the Overlook Connection are selling them with signed book plates.
Oh, neat.
And
okay.
there's a link to a local independent bookstore where if you really want a signed inscribed copy, you can get a copy through them, and I'll drop by the store and sign them for people.
Very cool. And again, if you're listening, we always recommend supporting your local small bookstores. Left Bank Books, or like we mentioned, Main Street Books in St. Charles is a great place. If they don't have it, they can definitely order it for you. So make sure you check that out as a place to go to. As we've just got another minute or two here with you, you're a writer. You obviously are quite a voracious reader too. In your spare time when you're relaxing, do you read, or is there something else to kind of take the writing and the author kind of card out of the mix, and you enjoy, like video games or something that you do that engages a different part of your brain?
Yeah, I'm not big into the video games other than really stupid little things like Angry Birds. I read a lot. I'm quite addicted to streaming crime series, especially the Scandinavian ones. Currently, I'm watching a German series called Cleo, which is set in Berlin around the time that the wall came down. It's got a very strong Killing Eve vibe to it.
Ooh.
So I'm enjoying that one a lot.
Cleo, it's CLEO?
KLEO.
KLEO. All right, we'll make a note of that one.
And this was a Stephen King recommendation.
Oh, well, let's I'll put that one down. My wife and I are always looking for new shows to stream, and we just blew through Gallivant. So we're looking for something to change up went from lighthearted musical comedy, so now we'll dive into some crime. And in Germany, that sounds good. Yeah. And again, you're active on social media as well. People want to keep up with you. They can follow you on Instagram, Twitter, things like that.
All over the place, at Bev Vincent and most of those places. But yeah, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram. Not on TikTok because I'm too old. I just don't understand it.
Same. I feel the same way. But that's great. And we'll have a link to your website in the show notes. So if you're listening to this in the podcast form, scroll down to the bottom of the page, and we'll have a link to Bev's website, and you can see all the cool things he's been up to. Thank you very much for your time tonight. And again, if you're listening, check it out. I'll get it right this time. Stephen King, A Complete Exploration of His Work, His Life, and His Influences by Bev Vincent. Very excited to give that one a read. Stephen King fans, young and old, entrenched fans and brand new ones. This should be a book that's great for you to check out. Bev Vincent, continued success. Thanks for your time tonight. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And we're going to take another quick commercial break. We're going to come right back On Geek to Me Radio, please stand by.
That drives you crazy how you about my tune. He's the one, the only hipster.
Meet the Pretenders, who wear a bunch of cats who'll do anything to get out of this pet shop, even dress up like other animals. Shh. So if you see us in your neighborhood and you find out we're not what you think we are, you're the best bunny ever. Purr? You're not a bunny. You're a cat. Don't tell, okay? Don't worry. It'll be our secret.
The Pretenders from Fisher-Price. Squeeze them, and they really purr.
Hoss Wampa Cave! Look's inside! It connects to Hoss Iron Cannon.
Introducing Hoss World, 3 playsets in 1, new from Star Wars Micro Collection line. 19 die-cast figures and action poses included.
Closed doors. Raised tower. Activate Iron Cannon. Connected to Hoss generator attack. Scoutwalkers hit. Target generated. The world of Hoss is now! Yeah!
Hoss World from Star Wars Micro Collection line. Playsets also sold separately, figures included, new from Kenner.
You can wish upon a star fairy.
I've been so busy granting wishes, I'm tired. Well, let's fly home to the land of wish come true, and you ride.
Hi, this is Neil Ross, the voice of a plethora of animation and game characters. One of them would be the Green Goblin and Spider-Man, who reminds you...
You're listening to Geek to Me Radio.
We are back on Geek to Me Radio. I'm your host, James Enstall. I want to make sure we tell you about our official comic book sponsor, Bugs Comics and Games. If you're looking for a new Spider-Man comic, I think they're in issue 7 or 8 just came out. The John Romita Jr. art on those books, the work by Zeb Wells on that series have been fantastic so far. If you're an old comic book fan, a new comic book fan, if you're looking for a place to jump on and get in some comics, if you are coming back after a long hiatus, go check out Larry and Tim out there at Bugs Comics and Games, because they will find you the perfect place to get involved, whether, like I said, you're new, returning, or a longtime collector and want to see what else is out there. They're buying collections constantly. If you're looking to sell, and I know I've talked to some people lately who are just wanting, hey, I've had this for so long, know when to pass it on to, I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of it. Check out Larry and Tim. They'll give you a really, really fair price. I know he's worked with a lot of people and bought some collections lately, and he's always buying. And if you're a buyer, if you're wanting to go buy them, it's a great place to go because he's always buying. So he's always got new stock in his store. So if you want new comics, old comics, if you're looking for games, he's got a ton of, like a shelf full of board games and older games and things like that. He's got action figures. If you want it, Larry's probably got it. Go check him out. He's right there on Bryan Road in O'Fallon. You can easily access it from either Highway 70 or from the Page extension. Get out there and see him. Check out the website as well, bugscomicsandgames.com. If you're not in the greater St. Louis, St. Charles area, you can order from the website. If you're looking for a variant cover that your local comic book store might not have, chances are Larry and Tim might have it on the website, bugscomicsandgames.com. Very proud to have them as the official comic book sponsor here on Geek to Me Radio. For this next guest, if you're enjoying the Sandman series on Netflix, that's a gentleman by the name of David Buckley giving you all that awesome sound, the themes for these characters, the rich tapestry of cinematic score that you're hearing underneath this series as you watch it. Fits really well with all the beautiful imagery from the mind of Neil Gaiman. If you're liking Sandman, you're going to love my interview with the composer, David Buckley. Right now, we're talking to composer David Buckley about his score for The Sandman, taking Netflix by storm. Audiences are raving about this, and it's due in no small part to the eclectic music that he's created. David, how are you?
Great, thanks, James. Thanks for having me. It's good to talk and to talk about such a cool project.
No kidding. I remember reading Sandman. I'd go and get it when I was buying my other comic books. I'm like, this looks really cool. It was kind of DC's kind of edgier Vertigo line. And you always kind of think, what would this ever look like on the big screen? And here we are seeing it, not on the big screen per se, but on the small screen and bringing these characters to life. Like I said, I have not heard anybody say anything negative about this series. What were your thoughts getting attached to the project?
Well, I didn't read the comics as a kid, or they weren't part of my upbringing or my sort of cultural background. But when I heard there was some interest in me as a composer, I started to poke around and look what it was all about. And yes, I realized there was a huge fan base for the comics, and that some version of this, whether it was a movie or a show or whatever, has tried to get off the ground for 20, 30 years or something like that. So I was well aware that there was a pressure that this has been in a gestation period for such a long period of time, and expectations from Netflix. So I felt quite a kind of I wouldn't say a big weight on my shoulders, but I knew this was going to be potentially very big, and it was over a year of my life spent scoring this in one shape or form or another. Well, not necessarily scoring it, but being involved, from sort of reading the comics to talking to Alan Heinberg, the showrunner, getting all his thoughts, which would also include all Neil's thoughts, David Goyer's thoughts. So yeah, I mean, it was a huge chunk of my life, and it was everything. I mean, it was all my existence. I lived and breathed it during that time.
And I mean, there's not a bad thing to live and breathe with. Like I mentioned, it's a very eclectic score. Because I mean, with this, it's such a fantastical story and piece. That I know you've used elements. It literally ran the gamut from full orchestras, choirs, all the way to like modern electronical textures. And then you've got the different themes for the characters that have to be interwoven in an overall cohesive theme for the show. Where did you even start with this? Was it talks with Vanessa Benton and Neil Gaiman about it? Or how did it kind of, your ideas kind of start to pop?
Yeah, I mean, it was, Neil is obviously hugely involved in the show, but he and I never spoke directly. I think the way that this was going to work was that Alan, the showrunner, he was going to be my creative partner. Well, that's a kind of, he was going to be my boss, tell me whether he liked what I was writing or not. But we've actually got a season out there. Let's call it creative partnership. But no, Alan was very nice to work with, and he spent the early days. He said, "Look, here's all the comics on an iPad. Just go and sit and read through them, whatever you want to read." And then we discussed characters who are going to be in our version of this, and we discussed sort of hierarchy of themes, who gets a theme, who doesn't get a theme, because it's such a rich world that you can't say that everyone who walks on screen should have an identity, because it would get overwhelming, it would get confusing, and actually you'd start doing the drama a disservice, as opposed to being helpful. So a lot of initial conversations, and I was forewarned that this was going to be, we were going to be moving around a lot. Episode 1 is going to be here, episode 2 is going to be somewhere in 3 and 4. Almost like making 7 pilots in one season, and that's intimidating in a way, because you need to find a sound world that works, but then can also mutate and work equally as successful, whether it's an episode with someone going to a pub every 100 years, or someone having a match with Lucifer in hell. I mean, it's so rich, it's so broad. The obvious place to start for me was with Dream, and to come up with a theme, a tune for him. Mm-hmm. And that took a while. That took some wrong things. But when that was established, I thought that I have something that will be able to run through this episode. It might have to be twisted. It might have to be turned. And as you say, it might be symphonic. It might be electronic. It might be minimal. It might be expansive. But if I've got something that feels like Dream, and that had to have a full-on nodding consensus from all of those people, from Neil, David, Netflix, Warner Brothers, and eventually we got that nodding consensus. Then I felt, okay, I've got something that can bring me through these 10 episodes.
And Tom Sturridge as Dream looks like he stepped right out of the comic books. I mean, that was great casting. Great job by the the visual effects people and everything on this series to begin with. I kind of expected the bar to be set pretty high, and so far none of the fans have been disappointed. When you're working on a project like this, I'm curious. You got 7 directors that you had to work with over the course of the 10 episodes. Did the directors have any input at all, or was it all just by the showrunner and writers who said, nope, this is what we're doing, and the director's only job is to kind of focus on the characterization, the drama in the episodes, or did you work with the directors on the music at all for their particular episodes?
Well, my experience of American television, and even though this was sort of UK, US, we were in post-production in US, is that the directors sort of ceased to be voices, certainly a voice that I would hear after they deliver their cut. And they will deliver their cut pretty quite a way before I would be shown it.
Oh,
so
okay.
To answer your question very succinctly, I not only did I not speak to any director of the show, of any of the episodes, I couldn't even tell you who they were. I'm sure I might know some of them, but it's just simply that paths didn't cross. Now, whether they had any input, that was going, again, their voice may have been funneled via Alan, the showrunner, and coming to me. That's more than possible, quite possible. But certainly, there are already a hell of a lot of people here, DC, Netflix, Warner Brothers.
Sure.
Editors have an opinion, writers, everything. So whether they were part of that overall noise, which was distilled for me, I can't be sure. But the difference is in the UK, where I've now done a couple of shows, I would be working very closely with a director. They see, as far as I understand, in my experience, directors on UK television tend to stay on all the way into the post-production side of things. But I don't think that's the case in the US, certainly in my experience.
Well, and not to say this negatively, but it's sounding like it was a lonely job. You didn't have contact with Neil. You didn't get to talk to the directors. Everything was going through Alan, which I'm assuming is great professionally, because you are, as you said, filtering out a bunch of noise, a bunch of input. But at the same time, it sounds a little lonely.
Well, it was a funny old time, because we were in the pandemic, I guess. We must have been. And I had already made quite a big life change. My family and I, before the pandemic in 2019, we'd left LA and we moved to a tiny country that's between France and Spain called Andorra. It's right up in the Pyrenees in the mountains. It has a population of 75,000. So literally my home where I was working, my studio there, was up in the Pyrenees, up in a mountain.
Oh, wow.
But mercifully with insanely good internet connection, an upload and download of 700 megabytes per second. I didn't even know what that meant until I moved there, and I thought, wow, this is kind of neat. And Zoom became my friend, and Alan and I would have regular chats, and there was a post producer, Andrew, who he and I would talk frequently and regularly, and he was a huge kind of support. And so, yes, we all got used in that time to being kind of isolated, and I was no exception from that. But I knew that what I would say is, though, my memory of it was still something that was incredibly collaborative. I didn't feel like I was just stuck up this mountain and no one was talking to me and no one said anything, or I couldn't reach out to anyone. I felt utterly connected with all the creative people on the show, and everyone was at pains to say, I always felt like we were doing this together. I've worked on other things where I feel like the music's like a hot piece of coal and they're throwing in your lap and they're saying, you figure this out. On this, it was like, yeah, we know that it was like, yeah, this is like a tough nut to crack. This is difficult. This is kind of as hard as it gets, because not only are we starting a new TV show, which is difficult, we're starting one which has got so many different components, is stylistically moving all over the place. And the stakes are high. Netflix is putting a load of money into this. So, but it wasn't like, and Buckley, you better not go and screw this up.
Right.
It was like, Buckley, we're here. Here's our hand. You want to hold it at any time? We'll guide you and we'll help you. So, I wouldn't describe it as lonely, although physically, yes, I was somewhat remote, but emotionally, I felt very connected with everyone.
And looking over your list, too, you have such an impressive pedigree of projects you've worked on, from TV to film to video games. And I've got to ask you about one of them, Batman, the Arkham Knight, the Arkham games from that. Working on a TV project versus doing the score for a film like Nobody versus doing a video game series that's so, the huge popularity of the Arkham franchise. What was that project like for you working on that?
Well, it's a bit like, I've done other where there've been initial installments of the intellectual property. For example, I scored the Jason Bourne film, where there'd been 3 films prior to that, and I'd done a Call of Duty. There'd been a load of games prior to that, and obviously Arkham Knight has a similar kind of legacy. And specifically with Arkham Knight, there was the head of audio there, Nick Arundel. He was the co-composer. I was working alongside him, so he'd already brought a musical language to the party from the earlier games. But as ever, I think whenever you're on sequels or subsequent installments of things, there has to be that conversation It has to be a frank one, and it has to be at early, how faithful are we to what's gone before, or how far are we pushing it into a new space? How are we reflecting that time has moved on? Not necessarily within the game itself, but just in life, that we've all moved on. We're all older, technology's advanced, etc., etc., etc. So I felt, for me, it was one of reverence to Nick's source material and to the aesthetic that had been built and had clearly won over a huge fan base, but also wanting, with Nick's blessing and with his guidance, move it into a new space. And what I will say, one thing I always remember about that game is the composition. We worked on, with a great orchestra in London. But the implementation of music into that game was just jaw-dropping. Mm-hmm. The amount of detail that the game developers put into making the music really, because it's difficult, because I don't come from the gaming background, so I'm very used to probably a film narrative is one that suits me best.
Okay.
So something that happens over like the course of 90 minutes or whatever, 105 minutes. But the linear approach is something that I understand. I feel I can respond to musically, because I can say, if I put that bit there, then that bit half an hour later makes sense, and then that bit at the end will make sense. Obviously, in a game, you can't have that forethought, because it's dependent on what a player does in their decision making and in their ability. But what the audio guys do, video game audio guys, is they kind of breathe a magic into the music, where it's able to take on all these shapes and contours in a way that I didn't necessarily feel when the piece was written. So an absolutely mammoth task went into the implementation of the music in the game, which I haven't seen anything quite like that before.
And talking about in the comic book theme, you also did a lot of the music for the TV series The Gifted. So I know Sandman is a little more out there. Sandman, as far as the comic books, that's not what I would consider like mainstream. It's very popular, but it's not Batman and the X-Men. Were you a comic book fan at all before getting to work on any of these properties, or was it a learning curve for you?
I'd say it was a learning curve, but I think everything I've done has been a learning curve. I mean, I've scored. I'm just in the final. Well, not quite final, moving towards the end of scoring a television show I've done now in one form or another for 12 years, called The Good Fight. It used to be known as The Good Wife. And when I started that, I didn't know anything about legal dramas. I don't think I'd ever watched an episode of any legal drama on either sides of the Atlantic. The first movie I did was a martial arts movie called The Forbidden Kingdom. I've probably seen a couple of Jackie Chan movies, but I wasn't, I think part of the film media composer's job is you get engaged in a project and you learn about your new environment. And I think that's one of the joys of the project, that I feel I've been educated in so many ways since I've done this professionally, because I've had watching to move from many different types of storytelling. Yeah. And I think, especially if you latch on to something where you've got good people who want to talk to you about what they're doing. Sometimes you work with someone, they just say, look, just get the bloody music, don't talk to me. I've definitely been in that position. But more often than not, it's people who do want to talk about, what they've created. And then, I feel like I'm learning, and it's my job to learn, and I'll be a really good student, and I'll stay up the comics, or I'll read the story or whatever, and I'll watch, I'll let this whole thing kind of get into my blood, get into my system, and then only at that point do I think you can start responding to it from me.
One of my favorite films of 2021 was the film Nobody, which I think took a lot of people by surprise. No one really knew what to expect. The trailer kind of gives you a great idea what's going to happen in the movie, and it's not a surprise. It literally follows that whole premise, and the acting was good, the casting was good, the directing was good, the music was great too. And then I was looking like, oh my gosh, you did the music for that. So I'm going to ask if and again, this is not to spoil anything, if there's already talk about a sequel to this, is that something that do you know if you'll automatically be attached if they do a sequel, or do you have to like resubmit? I'm not sure how that, I know acting, obviously they bring back the actors from the first one. Music department, how does that work?
Well, it's a good question. I've learned over the years, old man now. I suppose I'm heading in that direction. Never to take anything for granted, which I certainly did at the beginning of my career. I mean, I remember being very friendly with the director. We did a movie, and then for me to help pitch with his next film, and all this kind of stuff. And then he got another movie, and he I didn't hear from him.
Oh.
I've got not very accustomed. I'm at peace with the idea that the business I'm in is a complex one. It's a fickle one. Actually, often it's frankly a nasty one. So I have having said, I'd be very disappointed. There is certainly talk of it. Nobody too. I believe that there's a lot of songs in the movie, rightfully so. They were well placed and well chosen, but the score, I think, elevated moments in between those songs and handed off to the songs, I think, with a sense of class. So I'd like to think that I was part of the success of that film. So therefore, I'd like to think that I'd be asked back. I've got no reason to believe I won't, but I've also had nothing to say I will. But I have to say, I thought the film was awesome.
Yes.
And when I was told about it, I spoke to the director before it was shot. We had a little conversation, and I think he quite liked me, and I liked him. And I had no idea what to expect at all. I'd read, even the script didn't really tell me how unique the film was going to be. And what I love about it as well, it's really tight. I mean, it's barely 90 minutes.
Yeah.
It's like this perfect little package of everywhere between fun, nastiness, and humanity, all sort of wrapped up in just under 90 minutes. It's kind of, it did feel like a little bolt out of nowhere, and I hope they can do something with it. And I think, certainly for Bob Odenkirk, because he kind of must have put a lot into that. Well, I know he did. I've read enough about interviews about how he needed to bulking up to become plausible in that role. So I hope he can have another outing in that character.
And to switch gears back to The Sandman, which if you're listening right now, if you've got a Netflix account, it is available as of August 5th. So you can go onto Netflix and check out this 10-episode series from the mind of Neil Gaiman. David Buckley, the composer for all this music, this, like I said, it'd be hard to nail you down as having a style, because as we've just discussed, the past 4 projects we just talked about, they're so vastly different. If you yourself had to say what your style is, would you be able to define it? Before we get that answer from David Buckley, composer of the Sandman series, I want to make sure to tell you about our official movie sponsor, of course, Marcus Theaters and Movie Tavern. They've got their indie showcase going August 26th. You could see Breaking with John Boyega. They've also got opening on September the 2nd, Gigi and Nate. And of course, on 9/9, the new movie Medieval. Lots of great movies out right now. 3,000 Years of Longing with Idris Elba and Tilda Swinton. And of course, their Kids Dream family film series, $3 admission, gets you in to see movies like Kung Fu Panda. And then September 3rd, National Cinema Day. Every movie, every showtime, every format, just $3. National Cinema Day, September the 3rd. So remember that, September 3rd, $3. Get out and see a movie. The invitation is out. If you haven't seen Thor: Love and Thunder yet, Top Gun Maverick is back in theaters. Lots of great movies, and the best place to see them is at Marcus Theaters, marcustheaters.com, the website. You can go. We were talking with Outdoors Dan during his show, in case you're listening from that show, and he's like, I don't like to go to the movie theaters. People kicking your chair, and it's just, I'm like, when was the last time you went to a movie theater, man? You go to the movie theater now, you got a hole, you can stretch your legs all the way out and not kick the person in front of you. You got the big reclining seats. It's like sitting at home, but you're getting the best movie sound experience, the best visual effects you can see. And that's the way to see the movies. These movies like Top Gun Maverick, they're meant to be seen in this type of setting. Go see them in the movie theater the way they're meant to be seen. No better place to do it than Marcus Theaters. Once again, the website, marcustheaters.com. Find the location closest to you. Buy your tickets right there on the website for the best movie-going experience in the galaxy. Very proud to have them as the official movie sponsor here on Geek to Me Radio. Finishing our chat with David Buckley. Before we took that last break, I'd asked him about pinning down his style, what he thought, from his own words, his style was.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think part of my job is to be a sort of chameleon, and it is to enter these new worlds, and to open the door and look in here and say, this is Arkham City, or to open the door and say, this is the sound, this is the dreaming, or to say this is ancient China. I mean, I think part of the fun of the job is to be opening new doors and seeing new vistas in front of you and being inspired by them. I mean, I think the question of, is it important that, I mean, I saw something recently, someone posted something about 2 of my scores. There was a movie that came out roughly at similar time as Nobody, I can't remember before, after, called Unhinged with Russell Crowe. Pretty dirty little movie, fairly, did what it said on the package, road rage movie. And I wrote a dirty little score. Really, no melody, just kind of angst, tension, pace, and sort of seething unpleasantness, I think it would be the way I would describe it. And then they said, Jesus, this guy, and then they mentioned another score I wrote, which to a film that anyone has seen, an animated film called Arctic Justice, which fell completely by the wayside. And that was full symphonic scoring. And you couldn't, and I think the point the poster was trying to say, how could the same guy write these 2 scores? Well, the point, I mean, I think the point is that I can, because that's what I do for a living.
Yeah.
I look at something and I say, I think that's what it needs. And I'm not learning like new musical tricks when I start a new project. I mean, what I know musically has sort of been grounded in me from, like anyone else for that matter, is from the first moments we start hearing things. Probably when we're in our mother's womb, we're starting to hear music. It's starting to kind of, be a part of in the recesses of our mind. As I became a musician, I guess I started to latch onto certain things. But I think my musical background's pretty eclectic. I mean, my grandfather was Indian, so I used to hear lots of Indian music being played when I visited his house. My father was a lover of jazz, particularly Dixieland jazz. So I used to hear lots of Dick Beiderbecke being played. My mother was a classical singer, so lots of classical music. I got interested equally in jazz, world music, ethnomusicology. I think I've just loved a broad range of music. So that's all percolating around inside me. And I think all for the better, because it means I can unleash any component of that or mashup of that on what's necessary when I'm responding to a picture. And I think the only thing that one might hope for is that, that perhaps there is a voice that over the years kind of grows and becomes one's calling card, but I don't know. I mean, I don't really know about that. That's sort of a philosophical conversation. And I don't really know I've got anything pertinent to say about that.
And there was a great interview. I appreciate David Buckley's time so much. He's got a new project coming out, Kandahar, with Gerard Butler. You can catch that in theaters. I know he's doing the score for that as well. We talked a little bit briefly about that. The whole interview, there's not much more left of it, but I want to make sure I'm out on time for a change. So we're going to have the rest of that full interview up on geektomeradio.com here as soon as probably by Wednesday, Thursday, maybe. We'll see. That's going to wrap it up. Another show here. I want to thank, of course, Joey V sitting across from me, making the show sound as good as it does while we're here in studio and making the show look as good as it does. Thanks to him for coming in and working with me each week. Max on Movies is up next, so make sure you stick around for a great show all about film and movies. Max always has some great guests. We'll make sure to tune in next month because we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of Batman the Animated Series with guests. Tangential attached. We'll have some guests who were acting in the show, voice actors. We've got people who directed it, people who cast it, people who worked on the art, all next month celebrating Batman the Animated Series. And we'll have the return of Geek Trivia, sponsored by Kokomo Toys as well. Thanks to my sponsor, City of St. Charles, Bugs Comics, and Marcus Theaters. And, of course, thanks to both my guests, Bev Vincent and David Buckley. Until next week, my friends.
This is Geek to Me Radio. That's our show. This is Geek to Me Radio.
Thank you, Derry, Maine. Good night.
The Big 550 KTRS St. Louis.
Led to the FBI search warrant at his Florida estate. That from ABC News Chief Legal